Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. You know, if you go back to 1861, you'll find the ranks of the U.S. Army during this very early Civil War period are filled with thousands of volunteer soldiers with little or no military training, all of whom answered President Abraham Lincoln's call for troops to defend the country. I'm really interested in all of those who stood up, those first defenders who walked away from homes, businesses, families to serve the country. One of them is pictured here. His name is David Hayes McMicken. He's 27 years old, and he was a farmer in Lycoming County of Pennsylvania. There's a few documents that are out there where he signs his name, D. Hayes McMicken, possibly not liking his first name of David and just calling himself Hayes McMicken. Unsure about that, so little is left behind of his early record. We do know that he was a farmer. We do know that he was the third of 7 children born to his parents, Eleanor and David, lived a quiet life as a farmer in, as I mentioned, Lycoming County. It's about 70 miles north of Harrisburg, the capital of Pennsylvania. When the war came in 1861 and President Lincoln made that call, McMicken was one of those who enlisted. He must have had some leadership ability, or perhaps his age in his late 20s, older than many of the men who joined. He became an officer, a second lieutenant in Company A of the 34th Pennsylvania Infantry, also known as the 5th Pennsylvania Reserve Infantry. So we know that much about him. We also know how a year later, a year after his enlistment on June 21st, 1861, a year later, June 27th of 1862, his war experience took a significant turn. On that day, June 27th, was the third day of the 7 days battles. That's part of the Peninsula Campaign. And you students of the Civil War will know how President Lincoln was pushing General George B. McClellan and his Army of the Potomac to go on to Richmond and defeat the rebels who seceded and tried to form their own country. The Peninsula Campaign was supposed to end all of that. It's going to end in the capture of Richmond, the surrender of the Confederate Army, and the end of the rebellion after a year of war. Put it all behind us and move on. Of course, it wasn't quite like that. On that third day, it was supposed to be a day of rest for McMicken and the 34th. The regiment, the Pennsylvanians, and its division, which was part of the Union Army's 5th Corps, had been attacked the previous day at Mechanicsville, Virginia, only 6 miles from the Confederate capital of Richmond. The division fought hard at Mechanicsville, and the 5th Corps commander, Brigadier General Fitzjohn Porter, had planned to hold the 34th in reserve on the 27th. But another attack by rebel forces early that morning in the vicinity of Gaines Mill altered Porter's plans. By 2 p.m. that afternoon, the Union front collapsing and falling back, the troops withdrawing, Porter had no choice but to turn to those troops he held in reserve, including the 34th, to hold the line at Gaines Mill. According to the lieutenant colonel of the 34th, a man named Joseph Fisher, the regiment took their assigned position and held it, quote, for nearly 4 hours under a heavy fire of the enemy, our officers and men behaving with great coolness and courage. We were kept under fire until our ammunition was exhausted, when our right flank was attacked by a brigade of the enemy and we were forced to retire, which we did in good order, end quote. The regiment, the 34th, withdrew at sundown, those Pennsylvanians leaving the field, less 56 casualties. One of those casualties was McMicken. He suffered a wound because of the fast-moving nature of the battle, the Confederate troops moving rapidly, the fighting that was going on. His comrades were not able to carry him away, and he was left on the battlefield to suffer his fate as a prisoner of war. Now, one of McMicken's comrades, a private named James Mild Smith in Company A with McMicken, wrote home in a letter to his family and mentioned McMicken by name. He said, quote, "He was wounded bad, but I don't think dangerous," end quote. In fact, McMicken was struck in the breast with a fragment of a shell. That could be touch or go for someone. On June 30th, just 3 days after the battle, McMicken was sent with other wounded to Richmond to be imprisoned to suffer their fate as prisoners of war. And he arrived there on July 13th. 4 days later, he was evacuated from the prison place to a hospital in Richmond, and his health was found to be deteriorating rapidly. At that point, he was paroled and sent north to recuperate. He wasn't exchanged. He wasn't legally allowed to go back into an active combat position, but he was paroled and he would await an exchange, which would come after the Union and Confederate authorities reached a deal. Meanwhile, medical personnel transported McMicken from the point of rendezvous to Baltimore to be treated for that shell fragment that hit him in the chest. While he was in a hospital in Baltimore recuperating, the weeks were passing. On August 27th, about a month later, the U.S. government issued a report of exchanges, formal exchanges that were made. And one of those exchanges included McMicken. He was being formally exchanged for an officer in the 8th North Carolina Infantry. So good news for McMicken. His time as a parole was ended and he could return to the 34th to fight. However, chances were that McMicken never knew of the exchange. In fact, his recuperation in Baltimore in that hospital did not go well. He continued to deteriorate and he succumbed to his wound on July 31st, weeks before he was officially exchanged. By the time that exchange was reported by the governments, McMicken's remains had been sent by a train to his family in Lycoming County. If you visit the town of Jersey Shore in the county, there's a cemetery, and you'll find a modest gravesite to Second Lieutenant McMicken. He would never return to the farm. He would never return to his comrades in Company A of the 34th, and he would never know the outcome of the war. But he did his part. One of those early defenders who heard the call in 1861 and cast his lot with the Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.